Welcome to our Chariot Auto Group Monday Night Memories. It is Monday night if you're watching this in real time. And we have had fun over the last year or so, kind of picking and choosing, Nate and I, some of our fun memories and things we've talked about over the years, and getting to experts and people that have been there. And we have that today with Bob Campbell, who is a longtime Purdue fan, and there's a story that goes with that, and we will share that here in a minute. Nate, welcome, and we're looking forward to another fun show.
Well, great to be with you as always, Alan. These are blessed for us too, and as you know, Twin City in its 49th year, so
49 years,
about half the age of Ross-Ade Stadium, but with a big weekend ahead, Alan, as you know, and the dedication coming up, should be a lot of fun to reminisce.
Yeah, the Tiller Tunnel will be dedicated. Arnett Tiller will be there. We're not 100% sure that Drew Brees is going to be there, but it's going to be some fun with that, and a lot of former players with that. Bob, I wanted to get with you, and you had something you wanted to show us from the jump here, from the start, that was important to you, because Bob Campbell, we need to introduce folks about Bob, the son of Verle Campbell, who people know, Purdue football know the Verle Campbell Award, but also Bob and Verle have been together, father and son. It's a great father and son story, and Bob has carried on a lot of the tradition that really spans 100 years of Ross-Ade Stadium too. But Bob, you can talk about what your Foster Farms picture.
Yes, thank you, Alan. I don't know if you can see this, but
yeah,
you can see it in the background.
Yeah, a little bit. Come on down a little bit. There you go. Yeah, I can see that. Lifetime. I like your socks.
Well, the socks and the shorts. My wife was reluctant to fly with me up to the Foster Farms Bowl, and then I said it's going to be warm enough. But it was very cold, and I have a story. I went to halftime.
All right, now why don't you get yourself back on camera now? Yeah, there you go. There you go.
And I decided at halftime to go up, and because I was so cold that I decided to go up and get a scotch. So I got a double scotch, and the guy said that'll be $30.
Yeah.
And then he said, "Welcome to California."
Yeah.
So that started. So I wanted to read something that you wrote about my father. You wrote how many years ago? 8 years ago?
Well, I think it was 2016, I believe, in Gold and Black Illustrated. Right.
And you said Leroy.
And we'll link that story too, by the way, to this as well. So go ahead, Bob.
Okay. I just want to preface that you said Leroy Keys, Stephanie White, Glenn Robertson, Bob Greasy, John Wooden, Rick Mount, Drew Brees, and Verle Campbell, who did not belong on the greats of Boiler athletics. And the correct answer is all of them. And I do believe my father, unfortunately, has not made the Purdue Athletic Hall of Fame, but in my estimation, and I'm prejudiced, he should have. So anyway, that sort of starts it off with my father, and I've got a lot to talk about, but maybe you can ask me questions.
We will, and Nate and I have such tremendous pull that we'll get that done. No, we can't promise that we're going to do that, but you're right, Verle and his contributions to Purdue athletics, and even when we wrote the story back in 2016. It is a big part of what the behind the scenes, all the things that have gone on in Purdue sports, and the guys that made it happen. And your dad was certainly one of them. Nate, fire away. You can fire the first salvo at him.
Well, you know, I asked you before we started to record, Bob, I'm kind of a memorabilia guy, and I'm curious, any memorabilia that you have from your dad that, you know, those that read the article will certainly understand why I asked that, but things that mean a lot to you that he collected over the years working with Purdue.
I think the biggest thing, Nate, that he collected, which I no longer have, is every football game. And you know, you documented that he went to every football game at Purdue for 50 years, including some they flew him at later age in his 90s. except for four. And
four games, that's right. Yeah.
4 games he missed. He did not like Florida, so there was a Miami game. There was a Harvard game. He did not do that. And I think the other 2, he was sick. But my point was, memorabilia, he must have collected, I don't know how many programs. And he had all those programs stacked up in a living room. And unfortunately, I don't have those. And of course, now they don't even put or print programs for us. But so that was one of the memorabilia. My dad graduated in 1917, ran track at Purdue, and he and 3 other guys won the 1,600-meter world record in Madison Square Garden. And Dad said it lasted 4 days, and they got beat. And then Dad went on to, and I do have his gold medal from the Inter-Allied Games in 1918, when Dad joined the Army and was sent to France, and he and his brother Floyd, and they were both runners, and the armistice was signed, and General Blackjack Pershing did not want to send or couldn't send the troops home. So he had the Inter-Allied Games, which was like the Olympics, except for Germany and Austria. And Dad won 2 gold medals, and one in the 1,600-meter relay. And I have that gold medal, and I didn't bring it with me to show you, but I have it. And, and also another one called the medley. And Blackjack Pershing presented my father with that gold medal. And so he came back from in the 20s, and Avery Brundage, who was a big Olympics guy for years, asked Dad to go back for the 20 Olympics, but he already had a job and couldn't do it. But Dad did start, he graduated in animal husbandry, but he really should have, he said later on, I should have just stayed at Purdue and been on the staff at Purdue because I spent so much time there. And so he got in on the original 1923 Ross-Ade Stadium seats, and we've had 4 of those 50-yard line seats for 100 years.
And that is that's an amazing win. And Avery Brundage, I would say the chair of the International Olympic Committee, I believe is what his title was, but he was as big as it got in terms of the Olympics. Talk about that and the fact that that connection between the two of you. You've attended games every year since then as well. I mean, at one point, we're at the Fresno State game this year, saw the Ross-Ade Stadium being redone, but talk about that streak. I mean, as a family, did that ever present any challenges to you? I mean, weddings, things happen during life, and the fact that he made all those games was an incredible feat. Purdue
was number 1 to my father. And my mother had to live with that, but their best friends were Red Mackey and Goldie, and Gladys Mollenkoff. So they spent vacations with them. They went over. Jack was the head of the hula ball in Hawaii, and they took a boat over and a boat back. And I do have one story about Red Mackey, which I told Mike Blitzky. They used to have, and I think they, I don't know, they still have a golf outing, and that's where my dad was presented with the Diamond P. He was the first one, not on the athletic staff, to get a Diamond P. And they used to have corn on the cob and steaks. And Red Mackey was notorious for eating 12 ears of corn on the cob at every time, and people stood around and watched Red do it. So that's the story about Red Mackey. But those were Dad's best friends.
Yeah. I think you're referencing because John Purdue Day, though I remember because I was attended it. Probably about Nate might have been about 6 years old at the time, but when your dad got the Diamond P. As part of that John Purdue Day.
Do you remember? you remember, Alan, where Tim McGinley was head of the board of trustees, and Tim and I were sort of classmates in Indianapolis. He went to Scecina High, I went to Broad Ripple High, and we figured out that he had gone through like 18 cars and so many thousands of miles just recruiting athletes for Purdue.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, that's amazing. Also, I was going to ask Bob, what your dad have to say about Red Mackey and just what it was like to be around the athletic department, the administrators, kind of day to day. I've heard examples of stories over the years, like President Hovde and Red Mackey maybe playing 9 holes of golf over lunchtime. Those kind of stories.
Well, that's very true. And Fred Hovde was Dr. Hovde was a classy guy. And he was an All-American quarterback at Minnesota, and they would do that. Dad would never say anything bad about anybody at Purdue. And when he recruited 103 athletes that got their degree from Purdue. And when he recruited on the fact that if you don't go into the pros, you will have an excellent education. And that did transpire. I could tell you a story about Fred Hovde. I was pretty active at the Purdue Alumni Association. And by the way, the John Purdue Club, Dad was a founding member.
Right.
And one other little thing, Doc Combs, who was back then, and he is a character, and his wife, Sally, said that my father was the first one to contribute money to the women's athletics.
Right.
So, but Fred Hovde and Dad passed away at about the same time, and they had pictures up in the old football building of my dad and Fred Hovde right next to each other. And I was president of the Purdue Club in New York City. I worked in New York City with Dow Chemical, and I was president of the Purdue Club in New York City for 3 years. And we always have meetings because Fred Hovde was on the board of directors of General Electric. And that time when those headquarters were in New York City. So we'd plan all the functions when Dr. Hovde was going to be there. So that was a nice memory for me. And when I was 6 years old, you talk about, I had my first football shoes were Hank Stram's.
Yeah.
Dad got those, and of course they didn't fit me, and I had to turn up the toes and everything like that. But Dad would take me back. He would take me back to the 2 years old. 3 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old. I was at Purdue. He would take me back to see the team afterwards. And sometimes I was a little embarrassed about it, but I got to know Hank Stram, and I met him in an airport. He was having his shoes shined about 20 years later. And he looks at me and says, "Hi, Bobby." I couldn't believe that. So that's a little story about Mackey's. Oh, and then when Mom died, Dad moved up to Lafayette, and he lived at the end of the North Courts, and Goldie Mackey was there, and Dave Alexander and Dad were. Dave Alexander went to Broad Ripple with me, and they named the baseball stadium after Dave, and he did some recruiting too. But anyway, I guess the other recruiting thing is that you've said is that Oscar Robertson and I were classmates. He at Christmas Attic, me at Broad Ripple. We ran track. We played basketball against each other. And his only loss was Oscar. And I was out in the front yard for some time, and for some reason in January, when his brother Bailey came and said, "Verle," he went inside, said, "Verle, Oscar's not happy at Cincinnati and wants to go to Purdue." And Dad said, "I made a big mistake. I sent Bailey after him to go home or to go down there and get his clothes. I should have gone down myself, and I should have had Stu Holcomb go down and just bring him back, but they didn't, and they talked him out of it, and Oscar stayed at Cincinnati.
The rest is history, as they say. Yes, Oscar Robertson, and there are a lot of great athletes out of the city of Minneapolis, where you grew up, and Purdue got its fair share of them. A lot to do, again, with your dad. Talk about just the when you had, what was your dad's personality like? Was he? I remember as being kind of a quiet guy. Now I met him in his later years, without question. But talk about his personality that made him able to sell kids on coming to Purdue. I mean, he'd obviously had a great love for the university, but had to do some salesmanship to get it done.
Well, it did, and as he said, and Red would say the same thing were he alive, that Dad did help recruit Johnny Wooden.
Yeah.
But Dad was, I'm an only child, but Dad was very austere, and he was very matter of fact. There was no beating around the bush with Dad. Yeah. And Dad, if you ask him about Purdue, it was all good, and the quality of education, and they would treat you right. And I inherited that a little bit. But Dad was really, he regretted not staying at Purdue. I have one recruiting story. You know the Holloway Aquarium?
You mean the Holiday Pool? Yes, at
yes,
Bob Holloway and Company. Yep.
Yes, well, Bob Holloway and I were on the board of directors of a company in Louisville, and I was there for a while. And Bob Holloway thought that I would recruit just like my father did.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a great story. He took me out one time, but I had an 8 to 5 job and I really couldn't do it. And we went to Southern High School and we saw this tall blonde quarterback, and this quarterback was pretty good. And Bob Holloway and I left, and he said, he'll never make Big Ten quarterback. He'll never do. And he never did. He went to Moorhead State Teachers College, and it was Phil Simms.
Yeah. The great Bob Holloway, of which there was I don't know if you'd call it the Purdue Mafia, but some of those guys with your dad, Bob was kind of in between age-wise, but they were, Louisville, and Bob was recruiting Tyrone Bedford and some many other guys from that area. And your dad's role in Indianapolis, they were two peas in a pod. What about that Ross-Ade Stadium? When was your first? Do you remember your first game there? And also, your dad was there for the dedication in 1924. But the stories of that, anything that you can share about your first game, but also that first year, the first of 100 seasons in the venerable facility.
And I hear you, and you had talked to me about that before. But, there's so many things that all of us would have loved to have talked to our parents about.
Oh, yeah.
But they pass, and you never ask them those stories, particularly my dad overseas in the Inter-Allied game. But probably I'm 85. I probably went to Purdue games since I was 2 years old, so that would be 83 years ago. And the only thing I can remember and we had good seats at that time. We were up higher, which was better, but 50-yard line. And then they built the differences and the glassed in thing. And I did not want to be antiseptic, nor would my father would not have wanted to do that. He wanted to be out with the people. So we're now in the 8th row. But we've always had right on the 50-yard line, and that's been great. But Dad used to take me back underneath in the locker room, and I meet all the stars at that time. I remember Harry Saborski,
number 1947, right?
Yeah, number 27, and of course I remember all the Bob DeMoss. I was a Sigma Chi. DeMoss was a Sigma Chi. Bob Greasy was Sig. Drew Brees was a Sig, and so we
Mark Herman, Jim Everett.
Mark Herman, that's right.
Yeah.
Purdue being the cradle, and also Sigma Chi's at that time. I have a story about Bob Greasy. I wrote him a nice letter when he joined Drew Brees.
Yeah.
My wife just corrected me.
You got an editor back there. That's good.
About Bob Greasy too, but this was Drew Brees. We sent him a letter. He was James, San Diego? He was in San Diego, and I sent him this nice Sigma Chi. Thank you. We're proud of you. And I sent him money, and I said, I'd like my wife to go to this game. And I never heard from him. And finally, the ticket office calls and said, Drew Brees has left you 2 tickets. And I said, when? He said, day after tomorrow. And so we jumped in, we got there, and he never cashed my check. And he upgraded us to 2 very nice seats. And I've always been happy that I communicated, and he did what he did for me. What a quality guy, continues to be. So
he'll be back, and he may be back. We're unsure whether he's coming back this weekend, but he is scheduled. He hopes that he is. I know that Arnett Tiller will be back for the Tiller Tunnel dedication. Nate, we got time for about one more question for each of us. So go ahead.
Yeah, Bob. What the childhood memories and your time, around campus on game day growing up? What do you remember? What was the atmosphere like for you as a young guy growing up?
That's a good question, Nate. When I was old enough to throw a football around, we used to meet at the Union Building, and then we would leave our parents, Frank Case and myself, and we would go over and find the band, and we would simulate marching in with the band and throwing footballs like they do now. The kids are all running around outside tailgating, and they're all throwing We did the exact same thing. Wasn't as formal as it is now, but I can remember doing that, and before we went in.
Cool. Yeah, you had the chance to. It is interesting because it is a full circle thing, because your dad had a lot of contact with prospects. It was legal, and then they kind of changed the rules some as your dad got older and made booster contact. And now we're to the world of NIL and transfer portal, where, my gosh, boosters have events with players, and they still can't directly pay them in theory. They are some places, I can promise you. But my point is, what do you put that in perspective of the fact 100 years of plus between the two of you, and that great, how much things change and yet they stay the same? I mean, look at that from that perspective and give us a little bit of that.
It was a matter of magnitude. And Dad, at an older age, took me into the bank and said, now that lockbox out there, that contains some money for Purdue recruits or people that were really there already. Yeah. And he would go around to Oscar Herbst and Carl Vogelsang and some of his buddies, and he would ask for $20 or $30, and he had some money, and he told me that if somebody came to Purdue and did not have any clothes, and their parents were, somebody had a funeral, they might fly him back and they'd buy him clothes, and then they would give him jobs during the summer. They had
big
to
part
work.
of it, yeah.
And so that was perfectly legal. One thing Dad did tell me when we talk about basketball is Dad never liked IU. Dad,
imagine that.
Dad didn't even want to go to Blooming for a game. And if we did go for a game, we got out of there real quick. And he also he wouldn't have a medical doctor that went to Indiana medical school. Well, almost all the doctors in Indiana went to
I get a
IU.
hard time.
So he did that, but he also said that Bobby Knight did not cheat, and he knew that the Big Ten had a sort of a fraternity, and there was a little give and take with suits and flights or bus rides or something, but he didn't think anybody really went outside, and he included Notre Dame in that. He didn't think Notre Dame cheated. Now I could talk about Kentucky and I could places like that.
Kansas, yeah.
Maybe I better leave that alone.
Well, we had to turn this into a real podcast. We'd be doing that, and we'd have millions of viewers. But we're going to have plenty there as well. Bob, thanks so much for sharing some of these stories. We'll do this again. 85 years young, still watching the Boilermakers from the Tucson, Arizona area,
or at home,
or at home. But also, it's homecoming this week. Purdue needs a win, something fierce. Again, with the Fighting Illini come to town, but we'll see how that goes.
Can I make one last statement?
You may.
Okay, it's been a pleasure meeting you, Nate, and talking to you, Alan, and we've known each other since we stood in line in a Rose Bowl game, and it was freezing in the morning, and we were in line for coffee, and that had to be a number of years ago. That right.
January 1st, 2001.
Was that it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say was that you had mentioned to me, Dad and I eventually are going to donate some funds to the Purdue Athletic Department. It's going to be just a little south of $1 million. And I think we're probably going to do it. Your suggestion is in an athletic scholarship. And if I had to choose, I think Dad liked football slightly better, different from most Hoosiers, but I think we'll probably work on it. And I might ask your suggestions, Alan, on doing that. I'd like to ask one favor. I don't know if it's too late, but Jim Verjeek, I must have given him 5 years worth of stuff to get Dad in the Athletic Hall of Fame at Purdue, and it never happened. So if it's not too late, maybe you guys could work on it for my father.
Well, we know Verjeek well, and I know that he's one of the guys that puts that together. We'll put the whammy on him for that as best we can. So, but it is truly your dad is certainly, and your involvement over the years have been really, really important to the growth and the story of Purdue sports, going all the way back to the late 19 teens, and that's impressive in its own right. So we're going to link the story too that we wrote a bit, and we'll enjoy that. Nate, thanks again for your time. Bob, thank you so much. Thanks to Chariot Auto Group as well. Have a great rest of your Monday, and we'll have another one of these down the road here, hopefully in the month of October too. Nate and I have fun trying to put these together. We appreciate that.
Yeah, and go Boilers.
All right, thanks so much, Bob.
Okay.